Today's session will look at PowerPoint number 4, which examines 4 poems, به خواهرم، حلقه، عروسک کوکی و آبتنی. Before we get to those poems, a couple of comments. One, I hope you received a quick analysis I jotted down of after our discussion of I Feel Sorry for the Garden. It's another attempt to communicate an impression of how a formalist approach to these poems can help us appreciate the poems as poems. Remember, there are other external and internal, extrinsic and intrinsic approaches. We can be interested in a poem as part of a poet's biography or autobiography, as a reflection of a period of history, as a commentary on society, as part of the history of ideas, as advice to readers. All these sorts of things have their specific approaches. My suggestion from the beginning was that if we're interested in why something works as a poem, this formalist approach of looking at the content and the sounds and the structure altogether leads us to better results than, for example, getting the impression that because there's a good idea in a poem, that makes the poem good, or because we agree with the poet, that makes the poem good. None of that really matters in the impression we get that the poem works. The poem takes us in, gives us a series of experiences, communicates those experiences to us, and we have a reaction to it. In the case of I Feel Sorry for the Garden, in my short review of it, I say first that it certainly appeals to our imagination because of its concrete, specific diction and details in its representation of what the attitudes and actions are of the 4 or 5 characters in the poem. That is, it doesn't just tell us about a situation, it brings the situation alive by having each of the characters, having the speaker give us each of the characters' reaction to the subject of the poem, which is the garden. We saw that in the poem there is a traditional metrical rhythm that is a combination of long and short syllables, and we saw also the sound effects of what we can begin to recognize as one of Forough most distinctive strategies in her poetry, which is to use repetition of one sort or another to structure what she's saying. And repetition has one interesting effect for us at this point, lots of effects, but one of the effects is when we hear something the second time, it's familiar to us, where we kind of know something about it. And there's an increment to it. That is, even though it may be the same word or the same phrase, we have a little bit more experience in our minds and imaginations of that word or phrase. And therefore, the second or third time, the meaning of it, the import of it, it gets richer to us. And in this particular in this particular poem, in the 15 or 20 places where repetition occurs, we recognize that at the end of the poem, there is a circular effect when the 3 lines early in the poem about the state of the garden are repeated. And those 3 lines don't just give us a circular effect in terms of rhetoric or physicality of the text. It reminds us, those lines repeated remind us that we don't have any answers in this poem. That is, there was a situation at the beginning, and at the very end, despite the speaker's sensitivity, despite our review of 5 different ways of looking at such gardens, we still don't have a resolution. Not having a resolution, we've already seen, is sort of typical of modern art in general. Even if modern art asks older questions, it generally frames them in such a way that we have new issues and the questions remain unanswered. I would say in the academic and intellectual world, it's not uncomfortable for people who are intellectually oriented to have questions after they review a subject. It's kind of comforting to know, here's what I don't know. Here's what the issues still are. And knowing what it is we don't know, we kind of negotiate the context in which some things are unknown. So it's not satisfying in the sense of getting an answer and using the answer to move forward. It may be more satisfying in the sense that the way scientists operate. Today, they say X equals Y. Tomorrow, they say, whoops, we learned something different. X equals Y plus. That is, they have something that they can work with to act today, but something new will come onto the scene and they have to adjust and move forward. Well, in our situation, for most of us, aside from religious beliefs, from nationalistic feelings, from other ways, from family relationships and friendships, and besides those arenas, we have these arenas where we wake up in the morning and we still see there are some clouds there. We still see there are things unanswered. We also noticed that the poem had no end rhyme scheme. So whatever rhymes contribute to our impression of a text as musical or poetic, if there aren't rhymes, we assume if a poet is using language to its greatest effect, other things are going to take the place of rhyme. And those are the things we're looking for in the poems of Forough, which don't have a rhyme scheme. We also noticed that in this poem, the diction of the poem does not include the poetic diction we're familiar with in Persian poetry. That is, the allusions to historical and mythological figures, the representation of emotions and situations by using adjectives to describe types rather than individuals that aren't particularly concrete. That's not a criticism of pre-modern or traditional poetry. It just means that the modern poet is individual. The modern poet is giving us specific impressions of what he or she has experienced through the lenses, not of Iranian glasses, not of the glasses of traditional poetry, but the glasses that he or she wears for his or her own vision. We saw that in Dalan Baraye Baghche Mi Suzad, that from the very beginning we get the impression that their Baghche symbolizes something. I've asked us to remember that symbols, if you look up the word in the dictionary, you'll discover that symbols never give up their literal or specific or concrete meaning. They just get something added to it, which means if you read this poem by Forough and think of the garden as just that garden in the courtyard of a house, and think of the people as responding to it, and think of it as upsetting that people aren't tending to the garden, that's enough for a poetic experience. But as I say in this brief review, suppose we assume that the garden doesn't symbolize anything beyond itself, but suppose everybody in Tehran took care of their gardens. Suppose everybody in the world took care of their gardens. Would the world be a much better place without finding an abstract noun to substitute for the word garden? Just the fact of people appreciating beauty, getting the shade, the coolness, the colors, the nutrition, if the garden includes vegetables and greens and fruit and such things. So we don't have to look for symbols. The poem is going to work as a poem without going to that second level. But as with the case of Panjare, when we think that something is symbolic, we're saying that the poem is suggestive. And my impression from a formalistic perspective is that suggestiveness is one of the most significant poetic qualities of lyric poetry. That is, you finish and you think there's more to it than what you heard and read. Like when you ski down the side of a mountain, or look at a mountain from a distance, or on the seashore, or at a party and suddenly feel very jovial with your friends or relatives. You have this sense this is more than just what's going on. That's enough to make the experience when it's in writing, poetic. As for symbolic import, you remember the other day, last week we talked about some of the possibilities, and I didn't emphasize enough one limiting aspect of finding symbol in something. Everything that the five characters think about with respect to the garden, every reaction which they have with respect to the garden, every definition they have of the garden, the physical relationship of the garden to their lives, we have to account for that if we want the garden to symbolize something. So, for example, if the father has actually created the garden or paid a gardener to take care of the garden and now has a different attitude toward the garden, can the garden be something that is outside of the realm of what those facts determine? And that's why I had question marks about our notion that maybe the garden could be Iran, or maybe the garden, what were some of the other possibilities? Maybe it could be the wasteland that's around the world, Iran being part of it. I might mention Sadiq Chubak has a very interesting poem. He's more famous as a novelist and short story writer in 1942 or 1943 called Aha Insan. Aha Insan. You might look it up online. It's an interesting poem because this idea that the modern world was out of tune, was becoming a desert, industrialization, wars, lack of continuity and intimate relationships among people. Most famous in T.S. Eliot's poem called The Wasteland, but it was on the minds of lots of people. And the brother in this poem, in fact, thinks that Iran is a wasteland, or thinks the garden is a wasteland, and thinks that if it gets destroyed and new plants come into existence, maybe something will be different. So we ended up last time thinking that we might, one of you suggested that maybe the Bagche hints at Iranian identity or authenticity or culture. And we spent a little time thinking about the possibility. Culture is something you have to nurture. You don't bring culture into existence, but you bring its physical attributes and its ceremonies and everything into existence. At some point, culture got started by human beings, and it has to be tended to. In the 1960s, for political reasons, economic reasons, social reasons, people seem not to be paying attention to the authenticity of their indigenous culture in Iran. They were paying more attention to judging themselves by an American or European standard, by adopting things American and European quickly, or some people retreated into history, some people sought refuge in religion, those sorts of things. In any case, I concluded that brief essay by suggesting that whether we find it, the garden, symbolic of something beyond itself or not, we can for sure say that a basic part of the appeal of the poem is the fact of its suggestiveness. It gets us feeling that there's something behind the words, feeling that there's something more in the garden than what physical plants, bushes, trees, flowers are in the garden. And that may be a key in general to poetic appeal in this poem, as I think it is for lots of us at museums. We walk by a poem, spend a couple minutes, really get taken in by the painting that we're looking at, and we just have this momentary feeling, if I had time and I sat here for an hour, it would talk to me more. We enjoy what's physically there, and we have the impression that there is more than meets the eye. One other thing I might do before we get to PowerPoint number 4 is make a comment or two about a Zoom talk I attended the other day. It was a talk on the poetry of Alamtaj Jaleh Qaim Maqami, early 20th century poet who produced 50 or 60 poems, traditional rhyme schemes, traditional metrical patterns, traditional imagery, traditional figures of speech, but she introduced her own personal situation, unhappy situation before marriage, during marriage, after marriage, in life in general. And she never published these poems. Her brother, I think, or her son, Pejman Vakhtiyari, published them years later after her death. And the speaker the other day talked about the function of Jardin's poetry being her revealing her unhappiness and reasons for unhappiness in life. And in one particular poem, just by random, I opened it this morning. My husband neither loves his children and wife nor gives any sign of affection. A horse, a gun, and money, and only money, are attractive images in his mind. He'll have nothing to do with poets and poetry. And she goes on and on in any number of poems. If I were to read this in a newspaper article, what I read would make me sad. That is, I feel sorry for this woman. Life, her menfolk, patriarchal culture has not treated her fairly. And I'd want to do something about it. And in fact, her poems are full of advice and reminders of a situation that existed in Iran that people have fought to change. But at the same time, I say to myself, what am I experiencing when I read these poems? And she has a couple of poems where she talks to her mirror, or she talks about what a mirror does and achieves a kind of, we've talked about this a little bit, aesthetic distance, Zیباشناختی, where the poet has to get beyond his or her own personal experiences as experienced and communicate them in such a way that we have the experience, and whether or not the poet is a friend or relatives of ours, we're going to feel sad because of the experience as communicated in the text. She doesn't do this very much. And I have suggested that Forough had some early poems like Surou de Pekar, in which she doesn't do it. And let's turn now to, well, we'll start at the beginning. Let's look at the second slide of today's PowerPoint. I've grouped the poems today, there, the slide with the photographs, with the illustrations. As you noticed, I've grouped the poems in different sessions on subjects. Not that that's what makes statements in such poems poetic, but we have these arenas, so to speak. We're going to look at life and love in the next session, in the final, life and poetry, and in the final session, love. And the session today, the subject is women in Iran. And I have these 8 images. We've got a film star, Puri Banai, second from the right, Parveen Ettasami, kind of an appropriate figure in the Islamic Republic of Iran if they want to give us a poet who happens to be a woman. That is, she was traditional in her dress, so to speak. An image I've always liked is this child's painting in the second from the right on the upper register. In the early 1970s, I guess in class, the children were asked, do a picture of your family. And some kids, 6 or 7 years of age, did this painting. In my life, in 6 years in Iran, if somebody said, draw a picture of an Iranian family, neither the painting would have these figures in it as depicted, nor would it have the mosque in the background. That is, university life, neighborhoods around universities, libraries, bookstores, social gatherings, a couple of museums, travel around the country. That is, I would not have appreciated the possibility that the core to Iranian life, as seen by a grammar school kid in 1972 or whenever it is, was a family in which the father wears a turban and the female members, girls included, after 7 or 8 years of age, wear chador, and the most prominent building in their lives would be a mosque. There are several reasons why I wouldn't have construed things that way. One, I didn't come to Iran with those kinds of images in the forefront, so I probably thought of some of those images as local color. Two, my circle of life did not involve these people centrally. And three, when they did involve these people, I mean people who worked for me or with me, or people of the so-called servant class and what have you, they had to adjust their views not to have the way they looked at the world interfere with what they thought I expected of life around me. It is interesting. I think there are 2 books that came out in 2013 on contemporary Iranian art. You can find the titles online, just Modern Iranian Art books. Google, and both will come up. Both of them, interestingly, without meaning to concentrate more on women. Here we have one of the books which have different guises, different kinds of Iranian women according to their dress, presented as the central subject of a book in 2013 that is trying to describe Iranian art from 1900 on. And we have a modern painting there in the bottom left of a Qajar era princess, I think. The second from the left is a mother of a war martyr. And the upper right, we have the Muhammad Shah Pahlavi and Farah Diba Pahlavi in their life, which in my years in Iran, I got used to appreciating. This would be equally unappealing to some Iranians, as I found the image to their left unfamiliar from my vantage point. And there we have a famous photograph by Antoine Sevrugin of an Iranian family, a beggar family, early in the 20th century. So women in Iran can mean lots of things. I've asked if we can go to the next slide, please. I've asked that when we read something like Call to Arms, that we think about who the speaker is, what women the speaker is speaking about, and whether the text itself realistically represents a situation in Iran, whether it offers, if it presents problems, whether it offers solutions to the problems. Ultimately, my impression of the text was it is an inspirational text. It would make a good speech. It might even make a good text in a newspaper editorial or an op-ed piece. But when we put it in the realm of poetry, I'm wondering what the experience is that I join, and then as a result of joining, have effects on me that an experience had on the speaker. And I think there's the issue in the text of there not being that aesthetic distance. Forough, the poet, apparently feels very strongly about this, uses her poetic voice to present this particular case of this situation. But I can nod and say these things are true, but I'm not certain where the aesthetic appeal for me obtains. I'm not saying you agree with that, but in formalist terms, in thinking of poems as lyric poems as being a series of experiences that get communicated to us, and a result of us, we have a new experience, and that experience involves the appreciation we have when we experience a work of art. Or put another way, suppose I put all the data behind what Forough says here and put it in a newspaper article, an editorial, reaching the same conclusion. that women should not behave this way or should behave such and such a way, would that communicate anything differently from what this text communicates? I'm asking that rhetorically right now, as we've been over the poem. Let's look at a new poem, and the next poem, Bechoharam, and we can have a brief discussion about it. A volunteer to read the text, please.
I can read.
Good.
خیز از جای پی آزادی خیش و طلب کن حق خود.
Excuse me, I'm sorry for interrupting. Let's leave out what's after the slash line. That is, there are two versions of these poems, and in line 1 and line 6, after the slash line, I add the second version. Let's forget about that.
Okay, so I need to read خیز از جای پی آزادی خیش خواهر من, right? Just, okay, I get it. خیز از جای پی آزادی خیش خواهر من, ز چه رو خاموشی. خیز از جای که باید زین پس خون مردان ستمگر نوشی. خیز از جای و طلب کن حق خود از کسانی که ضعیفت دارند, از کسانی که به صد حیله و فن گوشه خانه تو را بنشاندند. تا
بنشانند ها؟
بنشانند, گوشه خانه تو را بنشانند. تا یکی در تا به کی در حرم شهوت مرد مایه عشرت و لذت بودن. تا به کی همچو کنیزی بدبخت سر مغرور به یا I cannot read that
سر مغرور خودت به پایش سودن. سر مغرور مکس به پایش سودن.
سر مغرور به پایش سودن. تا به کی در ره یک لقمه نان صیغه حاجی 100 ساله شدن. حبوی دوم و سوم دیدن. تا به کی ظلم و ستم خواهر من. باید این ناله خشمالودت بیگمان نعره و فریاد شود. باید این بند گران پاره کنی تا تو را زندگی آزاد شود.
کجاست؟ گم شد.
اوکی. خیز از جای و بکن ریشه ظلم, راحتی بخش دل پرخون را. جهد کن, جهد که تغییر دهی بهر آزادی خود قانون را.
Okay, let's start with the physical appearance of things. Quatrain sequence, second and fourth lines of each stanza rhyme. Khomushi, nushi, ضعیفت دارن, تو را بنشانن, لذت بودن, به پایش سودن, شدن, من شود, فریاد شود, آزاد شود, پرخون را, قانون را. I've read the words or syllables before the rhyme itself to raise an issue. It looks as if these rhymes are not just decorative. In most cases, the rhyming word or the word at the end of which the rhyme appears is a pretty important word. So the poet wasn't just searching to try to find some word that's going to fill a space, and that's what we expect. Decorative elements are fine. We expect a rhyme scheme to do more than that. That's the first thing that gets our attention. It for sure has a traditional metrical pattern, but starting at the beginning of the poem, Khiz as joy, line 1, line 3, line 5, and line 21. Does everybody see that? So at least 4 times we have Khiz as joy, and the last mention of Khiz as joy, so it's that incremental repetition or anaphora, repetition of phrase, and the last instance gives us a kind of circular effect. It reminds us this poem doesn't have direction. It's a situation, and the speaker is mulling over different aspects of the situation with different kinds of implied or explicit advice. And after 3 stanzas in which he's as joy doesn't appear, it comes again, so we know there's going to be a kind of conclusion here. Then we have ta bekay in line 9, in line 11, in line 13, in line 16. So in structural terms, we have the quatrains, but we have another kind of structure as well, the structure of the chiz as joy beginning and end, and the ta bekay in the middle. These are not necessarily overwhelmingly significant points, and Forough may have done these kind of instinctively, those sorts of things, but it gives us another kind of patterning here, another kind of a rhetorical feeling about things. Then we have in stanza 3, something we may not all notice, instances of consonants, assonance and consonants. That is, the same vowel sounds repeated and the same consonant sound not at the beginning of a word repeated. Shahvat, ishrat, and lezat. So just in physical terms, that also pulls some things together. These words are particularly important. Forough draws attention to them by them having the same pattern. And they also are first level Arabic loan word nouns or masdar, gerunds. In other words, there is something about shahvat, ishrat, lezat as Arabic nouns that already put them in maybe a slightly negative cast. Is these kinds of Arabic loanword nouns are the sorts of things that men are involved in behaving with respect to women. And just one other item, and there could be a whole series of these items which help create effects in text. Remember, when we say that structure, ساختار و صدا و مفهوم are all together, they have to sort of be in harmony or some kind of a balance. We don't say, aha, rhyme scheme makes something poetic. No, it doesn't. If the rhyme scheme emphasizes words that are significant, pictures that are significant, meanings that are significant, that contributes to a poetic effect of that fact. Because if we just had any word that gave the meaning, that wouldn't be poetic. If we just had any rhyme, that wouldn't be poetic. Put them together, it might create something poetic. And there's another issue in this text that I have a question about. In line 22, do you all think of Rahati Bakhsh Delapur Khun Ra? Do you all think of Delapur Khun in general as being maf'ul bi wasiteh, a direct object or indirect object? Or is it in ordinary ways of thinking about things, be Delapur Khunat Rahati Bakhsh?
میتونه باشه به دل پرخونت.
Is that more comfortable یا هر دو عادیه و معمولی و بدون
راحتی بخش.
sounds a little, of course we've reversed the order of words. It's not subject, object, verb. The object is now last, which gives emphasis. Remember, any sentence wherever the orders man kitab daram, daram kitab man daram, whatever. Anytime we reverse the order, ordinary order of parts of a sentence, we're giving emphasis. So we are right to give emphasis. Okay, that's one. How about تغییر دهی بهر آزادی خود قانون. Okay, gets that emphasis again by having the object last. Let's look at that's line 24. Let's look at line 19 and 20. باید این بندگران پاره کنید تا تو را زندگی آزاد شود. Now that is a pre-modern use of ra. Is that correct?
It's not modern.
ببخشید شما منظورتون اینه که مثلا این جمله آخر که خوندین تا تو را زندگی آزاد شود، یعنی که اگه بخونیم تا زندگی تو آزاد شود چه فرقی با این جمله داره؟ منظورتون اینه؟
I'm not saying that there's any difference. I'm saying that she has deliberately chosen what appears to be a formal or pre-modal kitab hast, what is a pre-modern form in a text which represents a modern situation, although the rest of the form is also traditional. What would be the point of...
من یه جوری فکر میکنم وقتی که درست میگین که emphasis داره، ولی من فکر میکنم یه جوری داره generalize میکنه. یعنی وقتی شما میگین تا زندگی تو آزاد شود، یه جوری فقط به تو وصل میشه، ولی وقتی اینجوری میگین که تو را زندگی آزاد شود، یا اون یکی راحتی بخش دل پرخون را، نمیگه پرخونه دل تو رو، میگه مثل اینکه یه جوری داره جنرالایز میکنه برای همه.
Okay, well, let's just stick to this last one. That is, we agreed that راحتی بخش دل پرخون را, that's normal, as well as having به دل پرخون. And we recognize that emphasis is achieved by having the object last in the statement. What I'm suggesting here is that maybe to make things seem more dogmatic or universal, or somehow reaching back over time and bringing things up to the present, we use something which is not the ordinary way of saying things today. باید این بندگران پاره کنید تا تو را زندگی آزاد شود.
آقای دکتر اصلا خود بندگران هم اینجا چیز داره دیگه، بندگران ما دیگه نمیگیم الان.
بندگی چی؟
بندگران کلا گران اصلا کلمه قدیمیه دیگه.
We don't, Well, part of me is in the 14th century. So there are lots of things that are get on for people.
Sangin.
Sangin value.
Yeah.
Okay, that's another good point. So that's here too. That is, and what is this? This is not Sunat Garai. This is a skillful speaker drawing on resources of the language to give an impression that is broader or more emphatic or more definite. Remember, these more traditional ways of things seem as if they're impersonally more definite in their appropriateness. Anyway, there are these throughout the text. There are line 8, 19 and 20, 21 and 24. These raws appear. Each one of them seems to have something that, except for Gushe Khane Tora Benishanand, except for that, there's something else going on in them. In any case, so Forough has brought out the drums and bugles and guitars and everything else. That is, she has effectively drawn attention through the physicality of words to what's going on in the text. What do we think of it as a poem? Khwaran Kiyabashan, that is, which Iranian women in 1955 is she, or 1954, is she talking about or talking to? Not talking about my mother-in-law, who was grown up and had kids by that point. She didn't live her life that way. Not any of her 3 daughters who were pre-teens at that point.
اما جنرال یعنی عموما زن ایرانی وضعیتش چنین چیزی بوده است در اون موقع. حالا یه تعداد کمی مدرنیته داشتن و فرق کرده، ولی به طور کلی زن ایرانی در این شرایطی که اینجا میگه زندگی میکردن.
There's a rule in logic that says, and I'm not talking about saying something for rhetorical purposes, there's a rule of logic that says, if you have a single counterexample, a generalization made becomes untenable. In other words, if you use as a premise, people do X, and somebody raises his or her and says, but Y doesn't do X, then we can't have that first premise of people do X. That is, maybe what I'm saying is that if we get in the realm of generalizations, in a sense, we're taking something out of the realm of poetry. That is, the poem is not true to what the speaker sees in a particular moment, or all the moments that the speaker sees. Was Forough life like this?
No.
Okay. That is, her life with her father was complicated. And yes, there was some of this there. Her feeling about her husband, if we take Asir, the captive, the autobiographical, was her being in marriage, which she discovered after a year or two was like being in prison. As much as she loved her son, she was chained by having a son, and she had to escape. But she wasn't describing Parviz Shahpour, who didn't beat her, which is a question apparently people ask. Is your husband beating you? Why do you want to leave him? As if that would be a criterion for staying or leaving. But anyway, to use the extreme example, was he mean? Was he not supportive in all regards? Was he this, that, or the other thing? No, she wasn't in love with him, and she had to be a bird that was flying, flight itself being a state of being in tune with, in love with nature. So she isn't describing her experiences. She's generalizing. Do we have counterexamples? Yes. Then what is going to make this poetic for us? She probably would have to talk about an individual person to get us to reach the conclusions. Remember the difference between poetry works when there's a message that is teaching us something, if it involves an induction. If the examples give us an impression of covering all the bases, and the impression is a negative or positive impression. I read this poem and I know these women existed. I didn't meet any. So I'm saying the world is complicated. But if Jale Marami has a poem in which she poetically presents her situation, just doesn't accuse her husband of things, but brings to life a moment or a scene, that'll be an experience novel for me that makes for poetic pleasure. At the same time, I may do the second thing that some poems ask of us. Do something about the experience we've just had. My impression is, and I welcome a couple of comments here, my impression is that this more falls into the category of Surud Pekar than it falls into the category of some of Forough very effective poems which talk about the situation of women. Anybody with a different view? Remember, there's no right or wrong here, correct or incorrect. That is, I think, again, she, one, has not exhibited a fasilé Zibashnakhti, even though her life wasn't this way. She's really angry about how some Iranian women, lots of Iranian women, maybe the majority of Iranian women in 1954 were being treated, but she doesn't turn that into a poetic kind of experience. She turns it into a something at a rally for women's rights that would prove a very successful rallying point. At the same time, I would say that all those rhetorical aspects we saw, they're particularly interesting because she may have chosen to use a traditional form and kind of traditional vocabulary that is zol, mohak, or zaif, ilev, rather than specific words of specific events. That is, he didn't give me my money to go shopping today, or he made fun of me in front of the neighbors, or he slapped me, or whenever he says, I've got to come to bed with him, I've got to go to bed with him. Instead of doing that, she uses the more traditional generic images and a traditional generic form because that will appeal more to readers. That is, one of the problems modernist poets had in the early years is if they were modernist in their form, some people wouldn't want to read their poems. So if they wanted to persuade a person about something, they would have to use the kinds of forms that appeal to them. Any comments? Another impression of this text? Unfortunately, where Zoom is this kind of world, that is in my own 50 years of teaching, if I see a person frown in the middle of one of my sentences, I stop my sentence and make another sentence or ask them, why are you frowning? But I can't do that. Can't do that here. So I just act as if it's everything is a rhetorical question. I move on. But if there aren't any comments, let's move to the next poem, which I'm going to now argue is a similar sort of poem, but in this case, and Forough uses a modern form. In this case, it works as poetry. That is, we have an experience, and at the end of the experience, we have the feelings that Forough, it doesn't matter whether she had them or not, that she, because of her skill at poetry, causes us to have. Would someone else read this text, please?
میتونم بخونم.
بفرمایید.
May I? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
دخترک خنده کنان گفت که چیست راز این حلقه زر، راز این حلقه که انگشت مرا این چنین تنگ گرفته است ببر. راز این حلقه که در چهره او این همه تابش و رخشندگی است. مرد حیران شد و گفت حلقه خوشبختی است، حلقه زندگی است. همه گفتند مبارک باشد. دخترک گفت دریغا که مرا باز در معنی آن شک باشد. سالها رفت و شبی زنی افسرده نظر کرد بر آن حلقه زر. دید در نقش فروزنده او روزهایی که به امید وفای شوهر به هدر رفته هدر. زن پریشان شد و نالید که وای وای این حلقه که در چهره او باز هم تابش و رخشندگی است، حلقه بردگی و بندگی است.
I think I like Zendagi Rakshandagi is better than Rakshandagi asked for Zendagi asked. Because all the other Zendagi asked. Huh? What does everybody think? این همه تابش و رخشندگی است.
من فکر میکنم باید رخشندگی است بخونیم.
باید است باشه؟ اوکی. باز هم تابش و رخشندگی است. حلقه
بردگی و بندگی.
Okay, بسیار. Okay, let's look at the physical text again. Why does the third stanza have only one line?
Maybe it can signify the length of time.
Good. Remember, stanzas are equal in one sense. That is, the poet has decided that we need just as much space around one line as we needed around 3 lines, or as we needed around 8 lines. And in fact, the sense of the line is Salha Rafto Shabi. Now, we often don't pay attention to spacing in poems, but if it's there, it makes a kind of sense. That is, I would assume that somebody who is reading this for a group that didn't have a text in front of them would pause a little bit longer after Shak Bashad, then read this one line, then pause a little bit longer, and then continue. So we have to assume that in one sense, the 8 lines of the first stanza and the 3 lines of the second stanza, the 1 line of the third, the 4 of the fourth, and the 4 of the fifth, they're kind of equal in terms of being the sorts of phases that the poet has in mind that we experience. Does the poem have a rhyme scheme?
زندگی است.
Good. So let's start at the bottom. رخشندگی است, bandگی است. That's a rhyme. Good. Let's go a little bit farther up. زر, stanza 5. زر, شوهر, هدر. Rhyme. Let's go to the second stanza. مبارک باشد, شک باشد. Good. Let's go to the first stanza. رخشندگی است. رخشندگی است. زندگی است. Good. How about زر and ببر? ببر. It has an interesting rhyme scheme. It's not regular in terms of it being repeated at regular intervals, but let's say there are 20 lines altogether, and there are only 2 non-rhyming lines. The others are rhymed in different places throughout the poem, but there are only a couple lines which don't rhyme with anything. So we don't recognize it. We're not mathematicians when we read poems. We don't recognize this immediately, but there may be something subliminal that the stuff gets pulled together. When to the left of my text, I wrote down ABC for the rhymes. A, B, C, B, D, E, F, G, C, G, H, B, D, B, B, I, D, E, E. So except for the first line of the last stanza and the single line stanza, all the other stanzas participate in rhyme one way or another. I think that's just interesting in terms of the integration of the texture of the text. Well, what other things do we find? We find that halge itself, it's the subject, it's the center of attention. It's mentioned, looked at, talked about 6 or 7 times in the poem. And then we have anaphora, raz in halge, raz in halge, raz in halge. So we want to find out that if we're curious, the text is going to give us an answer to the raz in halge. But the text, because it's more poetic, I argue, than the previous 2 and similar poems, the answer can be various. Some woman who has not experienced this situation in marriage will appreciate the poem just as much as someone who has experienced it this way. Someone who hasn't experienced marriage will appreciate it just as much. That is, we're buying into what the omniscient speaker says is on the mind of the girl who's now a woman after years of marriage. Then we have تابش and رخشندگی, بردگی و بندگی. مبارک, شک. The girl, دخترک, the man who's surprised. And why didn't Forough put this in a separate stanza? Because this is an immediate reaction. He's startled that such a question is being asked. مرد حیران شد و گفت حلقه خوشبختی است, حلقه زندگی است. And then we have the people around them at the wedding ceremony. همه گفتن مبارک باشد. But the girl says, دریغا که مرا باز در معنی آن شک باشد. And there is again that interesting mara used for a kind of emphasis by making things seem more formal or maybe more universal or from the past to the present. Okay, what contributes to its poeticity? That is, these things I mentioned that are physical contribute to the poeticity if, in fact, they partner with what's going on in the text. The text has a kind of a narrative to it. It's not just descriptive. The passage of time is the logic that accounts for there being a change in perspective. I say it's still more descriptive because it's about the halge, but we need a kind of a tissue of some sort of a plot that is time going on, time passing, for us to get to the punchline. Would a teenage girl be married and a great to-do about the ring, the wedding ring being made by people around her, would it be possible for her, reasonably speaking, to have a question? Maybe her mother, maybe an aunt, maybe the servant woman, maybe other people maybe teachers at school don't seem to, they've got a ring on their finger, but they don't seem to ever look at it and smile. So it's a legitimate sort of question. Would a man assume at the same time, more often than not, that he's going to make some young woman, give some woman a good life? He's going to be supporting her, protecting her. That is, her goal in life is to get married, and he is there to be a husband. Everybody else sees the same or says the same. But the girl who hasn't had this experience, but can have had, and we can visualize the experience as well, different experiences, says, هنوز شک دارم در این مورد. زنی افسرده looks at the ring again. It's just as shiny as it always was. She was hoping for the faithfulness of a husband, and those days, weeks, months, years passed, wasted, destroyed years. Now this, my personal impression of وفای شوهر is much more than the fidelity we associate with the opposite of adultery and such things. This is just the steadfastness of a husband to a wife, and having her be a center of the life, and maybe even some sort of equality. And so we don't have to imagine specifics. It's just a general tenor. Can a woman reasonably have had the experience that the speaker knows, uses the word afsorde, and what she sees in the ring? زن پریشان شد و نالید که وای وای این حلقه که در چهره او باز هم تابش و رخشندگی از حلقه بردگی و بندگی است. So there is فاصله زیباشناختی, this important distance between the feelings that the poet has and how she translates that into an experience that doesn't necessarily refer to her life, doesn't necessarily refer to her mother's life, but refers to, I mean, we talked about واقعیت عالم هنر, the reality of the world of art, not being the world of fiction, not being the world of everyday reality. Every time I look at the screen, I see this blinking thing that says talking Michael Hillmann, as if and then it says talking Mariam Sadeghi, but she was just laughing. Any case, لذت زیباشناختی, for sure. That is, we experience what the speaker experiences. We didn't experience what the speaker experienced in Bechaharam or what the speaker experienced in Surud Pekar, but we experienced what the speaker, not Forough Farosad, what the speaker experiences in her vision of, as a omniscient speaker, her vision of, in the world of art, this girl turned woman, unhappy marriage.
آقای دکتر فکر میکنم که فرمودین که این شعر بیشتر حالت نریشن داره و چی بهش حالت شعری میده، درسته؟ اینو پرسید. خب باید مثلا حالا نگاه کنین، مثلا توی ادبیات خودتون میدونین این راز با زر، خب اینا همشون یه نوع جناس البته این قلب دارن. بعد به کار بردن کلمات مترادف، تابش، رخشندگی، دوباره مثلا میای پایین زن، زر، اینا همشون یه جناسای درونی دارن. حالا غیر از اون قافیه درونی که شما فرمودین، ولی یه سری جناسای درونی هم داره. مثلا از همه بهترش همه بندگی و بردگی هستش که یکیش ر داره یکیش نون و اینا. این جناسای هستش که خیلی با دقت به نظرم انتخاب شده بدون اینکه خواننده خیلی متوجه بشه که اینجا داره صنعتی به کار میره، صنعت به کار برده شده.
It's not sahla mumtane. I don't know what the word is, but when you use an artistic device and it doesn't intrude upon the experience of reading, then it's all the more successful. That's why we can emphasize rhyme schemes, which rhyme more important words. We like decoration, but it doesn't seem like decoration is the reason they're there. And in these particular cases, none of them seems unnatural. And that is the appeal of things that are, let's put it this way, pretty. The appeal of things that are musical. The appeal of things that have sonality, that appeal to the ear. So it's part of the process. That we could ultimately say about a poem, yeah, I like the theme, I like the message, I like the way it was organized, but we could say, I liked how it sounded best of all three. And that's not a problem. The three work together, and we could make a case for this, what I call mutaradef bazi dar zavan Farsi, is very interesting. In English, we emphasize, in American English, we emphasize things by saying them louder, pounding our fist on the table, or somehow making the word be all the more, choosing the most explosive word, so to speak. But in Persian, and it's from Rudaki on, we see it, to give special emphasis to things, writers use two words. They're not identical in terms of denotation, connotation, and association, but very close in terms of denotation, and two words are kind of put together. To come up 10 centuries, in Sadegh Hedayat's The Blind Owl, there are 1,000 examples, and I'm not exaggerating, 1,000 examples of him using two infinitives or two adjectives or two abstract nouns or two concrete nouns with basically the same meanings. And what's interesting about that is, and he does it very naturally, what's interesting about that is, how many stories are there in The Blind Owl? 2. How many women are there in The Blind Owl? Dr. Asiri and Lakate. How many people is he? He's a youngish sort of guy, and he is the old man who sells junk. That is, the whole story is about duality. It talks about his Hamzad, all kinds of things. Talks about him feeling connected to some pen case cover painter from the Middle Ages. It talks about Tehran today and Tehran in the past. So Hedayat was very conscious of using doubling to give the reader the impression of psychological, thematic, intellectual, political, social, cultural doubling. He does it with language. Well, Farrokhzad with Raz, Zar, Zan, Bardagi, Bandagi, and all the rest is a good example of how we can use repetition in the case of Janose, Tajanosa, Avai, etc., to create effect. Remember in the first session, I used a single couplet from Ferdowsi, in which there was a lot of alliteration. That is, the first sounds in a whole series of words in the lines were the same. It's not as common a practice anymore in Persian, but when he has something dramatic to say in several of his most famous stories, he just adds that extra touch, which if you're used to not hearing the similarity of sounds at the beginning of words, when you hear it, it kind of it's not decorative. You kind of hear the increase in drama. Anyway, Mariam's 5 or 6 examples are really significant in appreciating the effects of this on it that have to do with poetry. Well, somehow we've gotten to the main subject of today's session without the session being ended yet. So let's turn to Arusaka Kuki. Has everybody read the poem? Well, we have time. Let's read it out loud if another volunteer, please.
May I, Dr. Hillmann?
Sure.
Well, I don't have a video, but my name is Tahmures Attar. However. بیش از اینها آری، بیش از اینها میتوان خاموش ماند، میتوان ساعات طولانی با نگاهی چون نگاه مردگان ثابت. خیره شد در دود یک سیگار، خیره شد در شکل یک فنجان، در گلی بیرنگ، برقالی یا برقالی، در خطی موهوم. بله؟
برقالی. من نمیدونم چرا ویرگول اینجا هست. It's in the original text, but it makes more sense. در گلی بیرنگ برقالی.
بله. در گلی بیرنگ برقالی، در خطی موهوم بر دیوار، میتوان با پنجه‌های خشک پرده را یک سو کشید و دید. در میان کوچه باران تند میبارد، در میان کوچه باران تند میبارد. کودکی با بادک‌های رنگینش ایستاده زیر یک تاقی گاری فرسوده‌ای میدان خالی را با شتابی پر هیاهو ترک میگوید. میتوان بر جای باقی ماند، در کنار پرده اما کور، اما کر. باید اون طرف هم باید بخونم. ببخشید. میتوان فریاد زد با صدایی سخت کاذب، سخت بیگانه، دوست می‌دارم. میتوان در بازوان جیره یک مرد ماده‌ای زیبا و سالم بود، با تنی چون سفره چربین، با دو بستان درشت سخت. میتوان در بستر یک مست، یک دیوانه، یک ولگرد عصمت یک عشق را آلود کرد. میتوان با زیرکی تحقیر کرد، هر معمای شگفتی را میتوان تنها به حل جدولی پرداخت. میتوان تنها به کشف پاسخی بیهوده دل خوش ساخت. پاسخی بیهوده، آری 5 یا 6 حرف. میتوان یک عمر زانو زد، با سری افکنده در پای زریحی سرد. میتوان در گور مجهولی خدا را دید. میتوان با سکه ناچیز ایمان یافت. میتوان در حجره‌های مسجدی پوسید چون زیارتنامه خوانی پیر. هنوزم هست، ببخشید.
خسته نباشید.
نه خواهش کنم، میخونم. میگن زبان صبح سر سبز دهد برباد. میتوان چون صفر در تفریق و جمع و ضرب حاصلی پیوسته یکسان داشت. میتوان چشم را در پیله قهرش دکمه بیرنگ کفش کهنه‌ای پنداشت. میتوان چون آب در گودال خود خشکید. میتوان چون آب در گودال خود خشکید. میتوان زیبایی یک لحظه را با شرم به عکس سیاه مضحک فوری در ته صندوق مخفی کرد. میتوان در قاب خالی مانده یک روز نقش یک محکوم یا مغلوب یا مصلوب را آویخت. میتوان با صورتک‌های رخنه دیوار را پوشاند. میتوان با نقش‌هایی پوچتر آمیخت. میتوان همچون عروسک‌های کوکی بود با دو چشم شیشه‌ای دنیای خود را دید. میتوان در جعبه‌ای ماهوت با تنی انباشته از کاه سالها در لابلای تور و پولک خفت. میتوان با هر فشار هرزه دستی بی سبب فریاد کرد و گفت آه من بسیار خوشبختم.
Thank you very much.
باش.
I heard some of Iraj Gorgin and Ahmad Shamlu in the reading.
Thank you, sir.
And
just keep it Tahmur Zattor.
And this kind of a reading reminds us of something. If a poem is reflective, and we have Farrokh Saad's own voice for many of these poems, but if a poem is reflective, we might just reduce our speed and let each of the images, each of the mitavans have an individual effect on us. That is, this is a poem that, in fact, asks the people it's addressing to think about things and to contemplate whether or not readers are in the same situation as the speaker is characterizing some people. Well, first let's start with things physical then. If we could look at slide 4.9, please. One more. It's not in there.
No.
Is there no slide with red markings? Keep going. Maybe it's after that. Nope, sorry. I have a slide here, and for some reason it's not there. What I did was I pinked in the parts of the pieces of the poem which had sad sound effects. And the poem has 59 lines, so we need to go back to 4.5, I guess. I'm sorry about that. 4.5. In 59 8 lines, I found 62 examples of sound effects. That is, there are, again, the kinds of rhymes we associate with a modernist text. For example, lines 5 and 8, Cigar Divar. Line 21, 25, and 26, Mard Velgard Card. 29 and 30, Pardocht Socht. 35 and 37, Deed Pusid. 40, 42, Dosht Pendosht. 48 and 50, Avicht Amicht. And 55 and 57, Hoft and Goft. We don't have time now, but when you read the poem over, you can decide, well, structurally, the rhyme scheme kind of gives a kind of discreteness to each of the stanzas which exhibit a rhyme scheme, and at the same time gives emphasis to the words that are rhymed, lots of them, in several cases, verbs, but allows the poem to do what modernist poems often do. It allows the poem to have what the poet is saying determine the form. Remember in Ghazal, do Beiti, Qaside, Hamaseh, the form determines some of the content or how you're going to say the content. In a modern text, it's the reverse. The content leads you to a form. Which is better? If Hafiz is successful in poetry and Nima Yashij is successful in poetry, the answer to that question is neither is better. And sometimes poets work better with the voluntary constraint. They choose to write a sonnet, and then they know it has to be 14 lines, iambic pentameter, 2 specific rhyme schemes. And some other poets, like the way some songwriters start songs, they get started with a line or a thought or an image, and form gets introduced to them as they move along. What, however, is there is, of course, as I have, I thought I had on one of the pages a English transcription with the quantitative metrical pattern. There is that as well. What's the most important example of repetition in this poem?
میتوان.
So it's rhetorically and structurally important. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, at least 22 examples of mitavan. That is, this is really possible. One can really, these are real possibilities. In fact, the repetition of it makes the possibility, the Mkan almost become ehtimal. You can do this, you can do this, you can do that. The other thing, it's almost as if you're going to do one of these things. But there is a poetic virtue in the mitavan, which strikes me as interesting in the effect of poems on people, if not in the poeticity of poems, and that is the fact that, unlike in Bekhaharam and Surud Pekar, the poet doesn't, or the speaker doesn't address the audience, an audience that the speaker is criticizing. The speaker is indirect, says one can do this, and the one here is a woman, different kinds of women, but also is inclusive in the sense that a man can read the poem, and if he can't put himself in the role of women, he can at least think of parallels in his life where he can be doing equivalent things. Now, this indirection achieves another purpose. And the most famous example of it in the literary history that I grew up in is the famous novel Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray that came out in 1832. The story in Vanity Fair is about the days of Waterloo, 1815. But Thackeray is criticizing people in 1830 for being vain, all kinds of vanity, superficial, duplicitous, hypocritical, posing, all affectatious, etc. But what he does is he allows readers not to have to indict themselves publicly, if you will, by having all the characters be a generation before the generation of readers of the novel. I hope everybody gets the point of what I'm saying here, is that people think they're reading about people from 30 years earlier, but they're really reading about themselves. And if they get a little bit embarrassed that some of the characters are behaving the way they behave, they don't feel it necessary to look around and see if everybody's staring at them, because literally it's not them, it's other people. Well, I think Forough has been equally clever in this text by saying, here are some possibilities. And you could say, I'm not like that, but deep down you may say, maybe I'm a little like that. The second thing that she does that's modern is she doesn't give any advice. She gives the situations in such concrete, specific detail that you recognize the indictment. You recognize the flaw in the behavior of women. Now, this is 6 or 7 years after, maybe 10 years after some of her early poems, where she looked around at Iranian women and saw how men had mistreated them. And as one of you pointed out, there are lots of women who are in the situation of the women in A. Bekhaharam ve Surud Peykar. But 10 years later, in the middle of the post-Mossadegh, pre-Khomeini era, or almost in the middle, somebody like Forough could look around and say, I'm not going to worry about the women who are poor, benighted, they haven't had much of a chance at all. I'm going to find women like the women in Delam Baraye Baghche Misuzad, closer to my class or in my class. And what's interesting about Persian fiction in general, from Jamal Zadeh down to Simin Danishvar, is that more often than not, writers wrote about people not in their class. Saadi, for example, has wonderful short stories and a couple of novels and plays and what have you. And they say a lot about Iranian life, but they don't talk about the people who are probably going to do the reading of this. Are you doing Neem Fasaleh on with Microsoft?
بله بله.
Oh, that's interesting. I can't do it with
با مک شما نمیتونی.
No, they have it somewhere, but they've never given me the right answer to it.
من درست میکنم براتون میفرستم.
دکتر میتونم یه سوال بکنم؟
خواهش میکنم.
یعنی سوال نیست، یه برداشته، میخوام ببینم درسته یا نه. یعنی این که مثلا میگه میتوان، همونطور که گفتین نه تنها میگه این پاسیبیلیتیش هست، ولی بر ضد اون شعر قبلی که گفت برخیز و اینا که به قول شما یه کاری میگه بکن، اینم یه جورایی ایندایرکتلی نمیگه بکنه، ولی این که میگه میتوان خودتو یه جوری انتوزیاستیک میکنه که بری این کارو بکنی. یعنی ایمپلای میکنه که همونجوری گفتین suggestive.
Very good. That's the second thing that's going on here. Even though, and that makes it poetic in a sense, in the previous two poems that were on this subject, the Surud Pekar, because things were couched in generalized terms of hopelessness, helplessness, cruelty, patriarchy, etc., no avenues of resolution of the problems or solutions were given. Here we have an invocation: stop doing that. And that's the solution. That is, stop being like a wind-up doll, which means don't waste your time doing crossword puzzles. Get out there and live. Don't waste your time being like the mother in Dalam Baraye Bakshe Misusad. Forget about Imam Hussein. Think about all the Husseins who are alive right now, your brother, your father, your husband, what have you. So very good observation. That is, we can imply what it is we can do to be more relevant by not doing what is done here. And that may lead us to a next activity in this in the analysis of this poem, and that is to identify the different kinds of Iranian women. For example, in the Iranian woman in line 27 to 32 میتوان با زیرکی تحقیر کرد هر معمای شگفتی را. میتوان تنها به حل جدولی پرداخت. میتوان تنها به کشف پاسخ بیهوده دل خوش ساخت. پاسخی بیهوده آری 5 یا 6 حرف. Is it دل خوش ساخت یا دل خوش ساخت؟ دل خوش ساخت.
دل خوش ساخت.
بله بله. Okay, what kind of a woman is this? Educated or uneducated?
Non-educated.
Excuse me?
فکر کنم non-educated because
Non-educated.
وقتشو تلف میکنه.
وقتشو تلف میکنه که مسلمه. Who does the New York Times
میکنه educated دیگه، در واقع educated میشه همینقدر که بلده بخونه و بنویسه.
البته اگه تمام این چیزایی که اینجا نوشته انجام بده آخرش میشه educated.
فقط در اون بعد قضاوت بکنیم. به نظرم she's got to be educated. You don't do crossword puzzles because you went to the 3rd grade. You do crossword puzzles because you got time on your hands and you think what? You think you know the words. New York Times has 7 puzzles during the week. Saturday is tough. Sunday's toughest. So my father used to sit and do it before lunch Sunday. I every once in a while have done Monday. I have other friends who do them all. They get them all. That is, they have the confidence and they know lots of words. Ziraki. Tahqir kard har mu'amay shagefti ra. What stupid, uneducated people do you know who are sarcastic? They're not sarcastic. They're not ironic. That is, to be sarcastic and ironic, you have to have a sense of the incongruity in things. So this is, I'm going to say, highly educated person, that is in relative terms. In 1959, 1960, what percentage of the female population, remember Mashhad University had just opened a year or two earlier, I think the same for Tabriz, small percentage of women, less than 50% of the women in Iran, 40%, 30% were functionally literate. So mu'amma, what stupid, uneducated people do mu'ammas? And so, but how do you use your capacity to appreciate incongruity and be sarcastic, to be cynical, to be ironic? How can you use it? You can use it by being a social critic, by being a conversationalist who engages in serious conversations. Remember, conversations are like chess matches. You can either draw or lose as well as think you win. Actually, nobody wins an argument, but the other person can be a better arguer and can have no more facts and figures. So you take a risk at engaging in serious argumentation and not being sarcastic or flippant or dismissive or what have you. Well, she doesn't do that even. She is resorting to something where she has some control. She can actually turn to page 56 and find the solution if she wants. میتوان تنها به کفش پاسخ بیهوده دل خوش ساخت. Yeah, I knew that 7-letter word. I knew what the famous philosopher in the fourth century Greece was. I'm okay now. Well, it might not be okay if that's what. Have you ever noticed? I understand why people at the beach read a book, but I've never understood why people at the beach do crossword puzzles or play solitaire. It seems like a contradiction in of nature, so to speak. Reading a book, anytime you can find peace and quiet. Reading a book, you're also experiencing nature of a sort. In any case, so she says, you don't want to make fun of puzzles. You want to admit when something's puzzling and listen to people, suggest your ideas, hear responses from people who know more, and move on in life. Crossword puzzles, I guess you could say for older people, crossword puzzles keep them thinking about words, looking up words, and it may help their, every once in a while make fun of, have you seen these commercials on television for Prevagen? You see these two older people who are sitting there and they say, we're having trouble thinking as alertly as in the past. So he took Prevagen. But all these couples they show are speaking very slowly. So I would hesitate to take Prevagen for fear it would slow down my everyday speech. In any case, so that's one kind of woman, the educated woman who's not using their education. Are there such people like that everywhere in the world? For sure. It's a shame. Is it a sin, a crime? No. But a woman might say, why am I watching Dr. So-and-so on television every afternoon, or this, that, or the other show? Why am I not engaging with other people? Well, let's look at another one. Let's look at...
ببخشید یه سوالم نیست ولی فکر میکنم که تمام شرایطی رو که یک زن میتونه داشته باشه در جامعه ایران در اون سال 1955 به بعد همه اونا رو اینجا ردیف کرده و این چیزایی است که او نمیخواد، یعنی فروغ فرخزاد نمیخواد باشه.
Okay, she didn't want them, but this speaker, this is not Forough Farrokhzad, this is the speaker of a poem. This speaker is demonstrating to us that these choices in life are not productive, right? She's not making all the choices. Remember, she's not choosing any of the positive possibilities. That is, let's suppose you're a female athlete. You're not reading books, but you're working out every day. Is that a plus or a minus?
It's plus.
It's a plus, a definite plus, a permanent plus. Well, there are lots of things that people do that are not in the realm of things intellectual, do not have relevance in the case of making certain that you have equal status with people around you, but they're nevertheless positive. Let's go through a couple of these. I kind of want us not to generalize. She doesn't offer all the possibilities, no positive possibilities, but as Mr. Delshad pointed out, implied in what she's doing are the positive sides, which would be other possibilities she could mention. How about 33 to 38? میتوان یک عمر زانو زد با سر افکنده در پای زریح سرد، میتوان در گور مجهولی خدا را دید، میتوان با سکه ناچیز ایمان یافت، میتوان در حجره های مسجدی پوسید چون زیارت نامه خوانی پیر. let's kind of the previous one was easy to parse. This is a little bit more complicated. If you know a Ziyarat Name Khan, the Mashhad Shrine, and you're a young person, and you go back there 30 years later, and the guy doesn't have any teeth, and he's all wrinkled, you might think what? You might think his reading the Quran and reading pilgrims' prayers caused his teeth to fall out and caused him to get wrinkled. In fact, Sadiq Hedayat in The Blind Owl has such a person who is like that. That is, it looks as if his occupation has caused him to turn out that way. That's not true in life, but it's an effective image here. Then we have the image of bending a knee for one's whole life, 3, 4, or 5 times a day. And then at the foot of the sarcophagus, one can find God in an unmarked, unknown grave. How is that possible? What does that refer to? Do you think there's a real Imam Zadeh buried at all the Imam Zadehs around Iran? There are a couple of Iranian movies in the New Wave movie tradition before the revolution, which describe the situation. That is, somebody wants to set up a Mehman Sarai or a Karvan Sarai, and so buries a horse and starts passing the word around that some Imam Zadeh died there. And people gather. They don't know who he is, and may not even have been a saint or relative of an imam. And what is it that people can find in worshiping at graves of saints or even non-saints? That's one way they can find God. Well, we recognize that it may not make a lot of sense outside of the realm of a belief, which gives you a certainty, which the word belief sort of suggests you might not have. میتوان با سکه‌ای ناچیز ایمان یافت. What does that suggest? What's the reality behind that? You give,
is it?
Excuse me? I didn't hear that.
ببخشید من در آن فکر کردم که برای اون کسی که اونجا نشسته داره گدایی میکنه میگه که یه سکه میتونه براش ایمان بیاره ولی شاید اشتباه باشه.
یا شاید برعکس، یعنی کسی که پول میده ایمان پیدا.
نذر کردن.
نذر کردن, good. Either نذر کردن or every time you give money thinking, aha, I'm a firm believer, that sort of thing. Okay, so here we've got a version of the woman in دلم برای باغچه میسوزد, ولیکن the speaker presents in such a way that we menfolk read this stanza, and there's no reason we're excluded from the indictment. How about, we're going to get close to the end of time here. How about the use of the phrase Arusaka Kuki in line 51, the last stanza?
A woman that has lack of veil upon her life, and people who are using her, giving a character or a role to that doll.
Well, how about Annie Lennox in her famous poem? Some people want to use you and some people want to be used by you. That is, in this particular text, what is the definition in this text of Arusaka Kuki?
To me, it feels like a pre-programmed person, because every time you cook it and you play it, then it plays the same thing. So you trained it or you programmed it the way you want.
Okay, but it comes after the word mitavan. And the word mitavan has been used 15 times before this. Isn't the speaker asking us to think Arusaka Kuki is just what she said it is already? In other words, and this is part of the skill that Forough is exhibiting here, if she had used the phrase Arusaka Kuki at the beginning of the poem, we would bring our idea of Arusaka Kuki into the poem. Have you ever heard that in drawing classes, drawing teachers, if they ask students to draw the chair that's in front of them, because they're afraid students will include their idea of the chair in their drawing of the chair in front of them, the teacher often says, draw the space around the chair, to force the student to recognize the chairness of the chair in front of him or her, not the memory and idea of chair. I think it's an interesting notion. Well, in this particular case, Forough is not asking us to give our impression of Arusaka Kuki. Forough is saying, for these women in my culture, Arusaka Kuki means what I've said it meant in 8 stanzas. In fact, if she had said Mitavan Arusaka Kuki Bud in the first stanza, it would have been unsubstantiated, undelineated. She would have asked us to create the poem. Does everybody appreciate the distinction here between putting at the end and putting at the beginning? Of course, it has the title, but titles, we can do whatever we want with them. They're not necessarily part of the poem. Remember, Hafiz doesn't have any titles. So we can be Mitavan Hamchun Arusaka Kuki Bud. And that Arusaka Kuki is somebody who can stay even quieter, back to the first stanza, and Iranian women haven't been very loud, she's saying, up to her time. Why would Forough first think of that? Because she's tried not to be quiet, and everybody has jumped all over her for being that way. You can stay at home all day. Why would you stay at home all day? Well, you've turned into this Arusaka Kuki, but we don't know that that's what the label is yet. You come alive when your husband is at home, or when other people in the family are there. You don't live, so to speak. Now, we had in the case of Jome, the situation which I suggested was a teenage girl situation of kind of being obliged to stay at home when other people could go out and do what they want to do, brothers and mothers and fathers. But here we have a situation where who says she can't go out? But she's just staring at things like Mordagan with a fixed stare. She's smoking a cigarette and looks at the smoke of the cigarette. All the things in the house, paintings on the wall, the carpets on the floor. But even when she looks at the carpet on the floor, she's not really seeing what's there. Why in line 8 or line 9, میتوان با پنجه‌های خشک پرده را یک سو کشید و دید what's going on outside? Why are her hands described as kind of claws or fists, and why are they khushk?
There is no life in them.
Good. She's not used it. She doesn't do that often. She doesn't do lively things. She doesn't do whatever is symbolized by saying, push the curtain aside, see what's going on. We've already seen that a window can be an opening through which you can be engaged in life. Well, this is also a suggestion that when we read a poem for the second time, we start asking questions about what experience specifically does this communicate? Again, not necessarily meaning, what specifically? This communicates the experience of a woman who's not used to using her hands a lot in these kinds of things.
And also, if I may add,
Sure.
not being truly involved, like, because
Right.
those hands are dry, but it's raining outside, and you're not that. It's not really involved with what's the reality out there, right?
Well, I guess they say the mailman is supposed to deliver the mail regardless of the weather. Well, my wife saw when she has something to do with outside the last 50 years, it doesn't matter what the weather is. She does it. That is, you've got clothes for it, or a car, or this, that, or the other thing. If you have a plan, you kind of keep the plan unless there's a flood or an avalanche or something. But here's a woman who the slightest inconvenience that engaging in, as you put it, involving herself in things would cause, it causes her not to get involved. میتوان بر جای باقی من در کنار پرده اما کور اما کرد دوست می‌دارم. One can with the slightest excuse one با صدای سخت کاذب می دوست دارم. Love can be lust, and the lust can kind of lust. There's nothing the matter with lust, so to speak. Nothing the matter with physicality, but kind of one-sided. That is, who becomes the object? The woman becomes the object. The man, یک مست, یک دیوانه, یک ولگرد, and we can imagine behavior. Literally, the man who has come, you've gone out together with the husband, or he's gone out and come home. He's intoxicated, wants sex. دیوانه, inappropriate behavior. ولگرد, okay. اسمت یک عشق را میتوان آلود کرد. اسمت یک عشق را. So the first woman is by herself. When she is with somebody, the husband who's come home, so to speak, she ruins a love. Okay, we can say, well, the man is the one who's forcing his affections upon her. But at some point in the marriage, she could have behaved in such a way that could have caused, maybe that might have caused a compromise. میتوان همچون عروسک‌های کوکی بود با دو چشم شیشه‌ای دنیای خود را دید. That is not really using eyes, not having eyes that just reflect things, that don't observe things. میتوان در جعبه‌ای ماهوت با تنی انباشته از کاه, metaphorical, like the عروسک کوی سالها در لابلای تور و پولک خفت. میتوان با هر فشار هرزه دستی بی سبب فریاد کرد و گفت آه من بسیار خوشبختم. The daughter, excuse me, the sister in دلم برای باغچه میسوزد may look at herself 20 years down the road and find she's in this situation. I would say this is feminist, but remember, Forough sort of draws the line in the poems that she approves of and publishes. There's no doctrinaire feminism. Not there's anything the matter with that, but it's kind of unpoetic. She keeps it in the realm of poetry. That is, the woman that she has in mind as a model won't allow herself to be a doll, won't allow herself to be just at the disposal of menfolk, will have her own life and activity, won't ridicule the world of the intellect or engagement in political conversation, however. I don't know about your circle of friends, but in our circle of friends here, there are a number of our friends, let's say the 20 or so couples who get together quite often. There are a number of the women, more than men, who say, let's not talk politics. As if that kind of interferes with social intercourse. It's a habit, and these women are just as bright as other women, but their ideas can be just as good. Their engagement could be just as significant. It may come with part of a territory where politics was not something you could talk about in the open anyway, a lot. In any case, ultimately, if we wanted to suggest what makes this poetic, I don't know that sounds as such, that is the decorativeness or the pervasiveness of the sounds, is as important as what Mithavan does, organizationally speaking, and what Forough does by very carefully and expertly using concrete, specific diction to identify certain modes of living that some women adopt and imply in each one of them the opposite, which would be a model for how women can get themselves into better positions. And a third part of the artistry, which I mentioned at the beginning, is using the Mithavan to make it other than a frontal assault on the women. That is, women don't have to feel they're being indicted. These are other women, so to speak, or other readers, but women can recognize if they've crossed the line and in some regards behaved in this way, in the way that Forough describes, and they might, even though taking action on the basis of what is in a poem doesn't necessarily have anything to do with its poetic qualities. I think that is the situation here, as was the case in Delam Baraya Balche Misuzad, except there we didn't get much indication at all, except what to do with the physical garden, the symbolic garden. We didn't get any clues as to what gardening would entail. Here we have some implications.
آقای دکتر میتونم یه سوال بکنم؟
خوانش کنم.
من مطمئن نیستم ولی میخواستم ببینم آیا نمیشه یه خوانش زنانه ای از این شعرهای فروغ داشت؟ یعنی یه تفاوتی بین اون چیزی که یک مرد این شعر رو میخونه، برداشتی که ازش میکنه و یه زن وجود داشته باشه؟ اصلا کسی در این مورد کار کرده که امکانی همچین چیزی هست؟
خب به طور حتم همچین تفاوتی هست. But as Iranian women have proved for 1,000 years, who like Hafez, they're able to join the realm of art, and in that realm of art, their female personhood is not all of the personality that experiences the poem. That is, women have been obliged in literature in general throughout the world to kind of translate the experience that they read about into terms that relate to their own lives. Men aren't used to doing this, but there's no reason why they can't. But at the same time, a man has to recognize that however much he experiences of an art, which is feminine, female, whatever word we want to use, he's not going to be able to get all the way into it because he's outside of the externals, with respect to the externals of that experience. That's like young people understanding old people, people of one race understanding people of another race, people of one gender understanding another gender. If you haven't had the experience, you're going to be limited in the percentage of the experience you're exposed to that you're going to appreciate in the same terms as the person who has had the experience. That's as much fun as it is puzzling and sometimes frustrating. I mean, why have we all opted to live in a foreign culture where until our dying breath, there'll be something every day that happens that we won't quite get in the same terms that people indigenous to that linguistic and historical and social culture get. On my worst day in 6 years in Iran, I was never bored. On some days in the United States, I've been bored. I mean, the first week I was there, I didn't know that Toftun was a lot better than Sangak. well, the second week, I learned what the word for Toftun was, and I never ordered Sangak again. I mean, that's just a metaphor for a million things. But I agree completely that this is a woman's club communication in one sense, but it's like a woman's painting or a woman's piece of music.
But Doctor, at the same time, as she mentioned, I think it has some effect on men too. There could be men that maybe were not awakened to this fact that there are women that are staying at home and experience. I'm hopeful that they don't know, and that they could be awakened. They could know these things. Further, I think there would be men that could hear these things and the call to arms, that could realize, oh, one day they could awaken. So I think there are lessons for men too.
Okay, but there are two kinds of experiences then. One, you're suggesting that men learn how some women are behaving, and at the same time think about how to make the environment such that women don't experience things this way. For me, in poetic terms, the more significant experience is that I get in the poem and discover that I can be just as guilty as any woman of lines 28 to 32.
من میتونم نظرمو بگم؟
حتما.
ببینید، همینطور که شما به درستی گفتید، این مثل این که، البته عبارتتون رو نمیتونم تکرار کنم، محفل زنانه هست که فیمیل با هم صحبت میکنن. ولی یه راجب پرسش که این سرکار خانم داشتن، به اون چیزی که به ذهن هم میرسه، متاسفانه اینطور هست. یعنی از دید مرد و زن خیلی فرق میکنه. خیلی اوقات مرد وقتی اینطور شعر رو میخونه و حالات زن رو زیاد جدی نمیگیره در کل، و حتی ممکنه اگر درکش نکنه به عبارتی که ما داریم غر بدونه این رو، اینو غر زدن بدونه، در صورتی که اون چیزی که پیامی که او زن داره رو متاسفانه دید مرد و زن فرق میکنه. البته یه چیز دیگه هم من میتونم اضافه بکنم در اشعار فروغ که اونایی که بیشتر دهه 50 میلادی بوده، البته این نمیدونم مال چه تاریخیه، ولی یکی هم بعد زمان هست در مرد و زن که باید ببینیم در چه تاریخ اینا سروده شده. یعنی در اون تاریخ، یعنی دهه 30 ایران، جایگاه زن چی بوده، پیشرفت زن چی بوده، که من فکر می‌کنم به الان خیلی فرق میکنه. برای درکش باید خودمون رو در اون زمان هم بذارید. متشکرم.
من فکر میکنم بیشتر مثلا وقتی من این شعر یا شعرهای فروغ میخونم، بیشتر از این که نگاه کنم که جمله ها چجوری هستش، چجوری ساخته شده، باهاش احساس رابطه میکنم. یعنی حسش میکنم، یه فیلینگی به من میده، یه غمی به من میده، یه جایش مثلا عصبانی میشم، احساسش میکنم. من فکر میکنم هر مردی که این شعر رو بخونه میتونه که قشنگ تجزیه تحلیلش کنه، بفهمه که واقعا مقصودش چیه. ولی امکان این که این رابطه حسی رو برقرار کنه فکر میکنم یه کمی مشکله.
این رابطه حسی به نظر شما ربطی داره با شعر بودن متن یا ربطی داره؟
فکر میکنم با شعر بودن متن.
If we read poems poetically and consider poems to be a series of experiences that are communicated as a literary experience to us, then all the differences or all the similarities between speaker and poet on the one hand and reader on the other becomes secondary. That is, I couldn't care less if this poem was composed in 1959 or 1962. I also don't care if this poem is about Iranian women. I experience this speaker's observations about characters who seem to be sorts of women. And the result of that experience saddens me that women look at and respond to, maybe are forced to respond to life in this way, but at the same time, the text is so artfully constructed that I enjoy the sadness. I enjoy how it was put together, even if the content gives me a feeling. At the same time, I'm hopeful because it seems very obvious to me that if I'm behaving the way the character who's depicted in 28 to 32 is behaving, or 27 to 32, if I'm behaving that way, I know how to make myself more alive, more connected, more involved in life. And for sure, in the section on religion, I know that I could have religious faith, but I needn't display it or behave in it in this way. Do you know what the largest gathering of Iranians every year is? A single day or several days? The largest gathering of Iranians in the world. No, it's Arba'in. Go Google Arba'in. The Iran you knew growing up, the Iran you were part of in school, the Iran in America you're a part of now, and just take a look at, listen to the sermons, watch the pilgrimage of Arba'in, and just think about whether that energy, and we're not accusing it of not being sincere, whether that energy might not have another avenue that could make the lives those people are living more engaged and more helpful to themselves and others. I'm not talking about Gamzani and those sorts of things. I'm talking about just tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people listening to a preacher saying things that are a little bit too elementary, too for us to use them as inspiration for life today. As for the distance between men and women in appreciating Forough and having feelings about Forough, I wouldn't argue for a minute. But I may be looking at or experiencing other things in the text. And as you may have noticed, that I have not, for one sentence, generalized about Forough to this point in our workshop, right? Mm-hmm. That's not the business of poetry reading, if it's for poetry. Poetry reading is smelling a tulip, smelling a rose, smelling a gladiola, and each one of them is discrete, unique, and pleasurable. Whether, if I were a botanist, I might talk about all the flowers together. But notice the botanist is no longer smelling the flowers and looking at them for pleasure. It's for another reason, maybe a more important reason. So let's take Iran out of this. Let's just put humanity here. Let's take, say it's about women, but let's say women are circumstances. Let's say it's part of their identity. Remember in Pnjm, we didn't find out till line, was it 52? The speaker says, I'm now a woman, or I'm a woman doing this Saturday. How did we know it was a woman before that time? And we go back and reread the poem. Do we feel that the speaker before was a woman? So Forough has poems where the speaker is circumstantially a woman, but maybe not essentially a woman. But any observation a woman makes about a text by a woman, I accept without reservation. But if the critic, a man or a woman, makes the observation about the statement by a woman as poetry, not as anything else, not as a message, as poetry, then we kind of have to talk the same language to agree on a conclusion. Any case, we're a short poem behind. Let's start with that next time. Ab Tani.